people who want to make Jefferson out to be a hero and a real great advocate of civil rights and civil liberty and freedom for everybody and da-da-da, they can point to a statement that Jefferson made where he said about slaves, and I can't quote it exactly, but something about it's certain that these people, meaning slaves, cannot stay that way forever. And some people said that means that he was looking forward to a time when we would abolish slavery, that they would be accepted as equals. All men are created equal, and that includes men regardless of their color. I don't think that's so. The rest of that statement, the next line after that is, it's certain that something that slavery will have to go, but it is equally certain that we don't know what's going to happen to them. And I think that we need to understand how Americans in general felt about this whole question of slavery. Certainly there were Americans who disliked slavery. There were many Americans who felt that slavery was wrong. There were many Americans who felt that all men should include men of African ancestry. One of the names you may know is John Adams. John Adams despised slavery. But like many other Americans, like most Americans, even if they didn't like slavery, they sort of accepted it because they saw two unsolvable problems to eliminating slavery. The first was, if you end slavery, what do you do with the African Americans in the country? Now, to me, it's simple. They're just going to be people. They're going to be like everybody else. Instead of being slaves working on farms, they're going to be laborers working on farms. There are a lot of white laborers on farms. We'll not have black laborers on farms like that. But some of them will become landowners like everybody else. Most of them will become middle-class farmers like all Americans. Americans are nations of small farmers. They'll be white, black, everybody else. And they'd be just like that. And we'd live together in the same communities, and we'd be friends and family and maybe spouses and get married, and it'd be just America would be a multicultural society. Well, almost nobody could accept that. Nobody could agree with that. Even the people who didn't like slavery, even people like John Adams, could not accept the fact that African Americans could become just like every other American. And the bottom line of this is race. They couldn't get over the race issue. Even the most liberal, the most enlightened Americans, even the most tolerant, even those who most despise slavery, even they couldn't bring themselves to say, well, they're just people just like me, and if my daughter wants to marry one of my African American neighbor's sons, hey, good for it. That just couldn't happen. Americans were convinced that America could only be a white person's society. I'm sorry to say that. They thought people who wanted to get rid of slavery in the United States had to figure out what we were going to do with the slaves. And they wanted to have them go somewhere else. And there was all kinds of considerations of places they could go. There was talk about having them move out to the West. There was talk about having them go to Brazil, which was had a very large slave population, or somewhere else in the West Indies where there's a lot of slaves, and just have them go there. The most obvious place was have them go back to Africa. That was a very popular idea among many of the people who disliked slavery, was to send the slaves back to Africa. But what killed that was, no surprise, money. you start looking at the numbers of how much it's going to cost to relocate Africans, the African Americans, relocate the slaves to Africa, and you figure how many there are, and you start looking at how much money that's going to cost, and the idea dies. It doesn't go anywhere. So even people who didn't like slavery, they hit a brick wall because they can't get over the idea that what are we going to do with the slaves? We can't leave them here. This is a white person's country, and we can't go with it. So that they just sort of shut down. I mean, it's like, I can't think about this because it doesn't work. There's nothing there. There's no possible answer. So they just ignored it. And Jefferson was in that category, although he actually was not a person who disliked slavery. There was a time in his life when he kind of thought maybe that slavery was going to have to go. He couldn't figure out what you're going to do about the slaves, but he thought we can't have slavery, so he's in that category of, well, we want to get rid of it, but we don't know how, and we can't figure out what to do, and we're just at a dead end here. But yeah, there was a time also when he maybe changed his mind. Some historians have kind of tracked when he would speak as though he sort of thought that eventually somehow we had to figure out a way to get rid of slavery, to a time when he thought, well, we're just probably just keep it, it's okay. And the turning point was sometime that somebody has identified was sometime around 1794, and by that time the country's independent, and he's in the cabinet and so forth. He's often in, he was in New York as a cabinet officer, and sort of like an accountant, and they didn't have accountants in those days per se, but somebody, or Jefferson himself, crunched some numbers, and he figured out that every time a slave was born on his plantation, his net worth went up something like 4%. Slavery is profitable, making money from it. If you keep slavery, you're just going to get richer. Well, maybe we should keep slavery. And that's going to drive a lot of the people in this country. Jefferson isn't alone. Many people looked at this and said, wait a minute, slavery is a moneymaker, because slaves have value, they're an asset. I own assets, I'm rich. If I get more assets, I get richer. If I get more slaves, I get richer. So let's keep slavery. And that's going to become the dominant answer. That's what people are going to look at. So there's a lot of people who don't like slavery, but they can't offer an alternative to it. They can't say, well, we could put the slaves here, where, how. And then you've got other people who do own slaves, and say, wait a minute, this is making me money. I'm getting richer because I own slaves. And we think that Jefferson probably fell into that category. That he says all men are created equal, and there's times in his life when he was really troubled by it. But when you point out to him that it's making him money, well, maybe I will stick with it. So I'm sorry to the people who, liberals who want to make Jefferson into a great liberal leader and a pioneer for civil rights and ending slavery. And he's maybe not as nasty and as ugly as some of the racists of his day, but he's there, and all Americans are there. They all want America as a white man's country. And just incidentally, related to that is something we talked about earlier. Indians also don't fit in America. Like the African Americans who have to stay slaves, Indians have to leave. We can't have a bi-cultural, multicultural society with Indians and white people, Africans and white people all living together. No, it's only for white people. So African Americans stay as slaves, or they're property, they're not people, and Indians leave. So Jefferson, despite his phrase, all men are created equal, he meant only white people. He meant only us. Then he goes on, of course, in classic Locke analysis, having decided that we're talking here about white male property owners. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And people have been talking about rights forever. When we still had class, somebody said they knew life, liberty, and property. That's the phrase, life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, here I'm willing to go along with some of the people who are more defensive of Jefferson. A common answer on this issue of what he meant by pursuit of happiness was that he meant property. I mean, what's happiness? Money is happiness. Property, money, same thing. Life, liberty, property, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, same thing. But I remember arguing with somebody about this once and saying, well, if he meant the same thing, if he meant pursuit of happiness to mean the same thing as property, why did he change the phrase? And I'm thinking maybe he was maybe a little bit ahead of his time. Maybe he's sort of moving into a more humanistic approach. Maybe he meant that by pursuit of happiness, he didn't mean just money. He meant some kind of a spiritual happiness, some kind of a contentment, some kind of a sense of well-being, whether you're rich or not, that you don't have to have property to be happy. I'd like to think that he meant, and I can't prove it, but other than the fact that he changed the phrase, it seems to me he meant something more. So he's trying to give us, as Americans, he's trying to move beyond this obsession with money, which was so much a part of American life. But then it's standard Locke analysis. Governments are established to secure these rights. All men have them from nature. We are endowed by our Creator with these natural rights. Governments are established to protect those rights. If a government fails to do that, then the people have a right to revolt and establish a new government. And for Locke, that was the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Now Americans are saying, it's us again. We're faced with a king who doesn't respect our rights, is not there to protect our rights, so we got to have a revolution to get rid of him. And from that point on, most of the document is a listing of all the bad things that the king has done to prove that he has failed to protect our rights. And some of those are things maybe you can understand what he was talking about, what Jefferson was talking about. Some of those you'd have to have gotten into more detail than I've gone into. But he's listing all the things the king has done. He's done this. There's a point at which he says, well, then he has conspired with others, and that would refer to Parliament. He's conspired with others to do this, to do that, to do this, and there's a couple things that they've done together, and then it's back to he's done this, he's done that. So what Jefferson is trying to do is really to sort of write some propaganda to try to convince the American people that this affection for the king is misplaced. That there are a lot of people who are still loyal to the king. He's trying to convince them, he's trying to win them over. We don't know how many there are, and we don't know where we stand on that. We don't know where we stand in terms of public opinion. We have no way to know. But we're trying to get public opinion to support the cause by saying, look, you shouldn't keep staying loyal to the king because the king is trying to take away your rights. He's trying to take away your property. And so that's what's the point of the Declaration. It's sort of designed to appeal to American public opinion and to convince people to give up loyalism and support independence. As I said, we don't know how many people changed their minds because of the Declaration of Independence. We don't even know how many people ended up still supporting the king. We know there were a lot. We know that many Americans remained loyal. But that was what Congress did. Congress adopted the whole Declaration of Independence and made the decision, which was a tough thing to make because You don't know if the American people are going to support you or not. But they decided to declare independence. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about that Congress did was to set up sort of a more real government. You know, people in Congress are real conscious of the fact that they don't really conform to our own ideas about what a government is and what it can do. We're not in line with that because we don't have any legal basis for being. And Americans are real committed to the idea that you have to do things by law. You have to do things right. You have to do things formally. You can't just have a goddamn parliament that says, well, we can just do whatever we want. We're supreme. We can do whatever we want. No. There have got to be rules. There have got to be laws. There's got to be some sort of system of formality, of officialdom. And it's got to be written. So they said we've got to come up with some sort of a written document that justifies what we're doing. So Congress appointed a committee to draft what we could call a formal legal constitution. And so this committee met as the war is going on, and meanwhile there's a committee off to the side trying to come up with a constitution, and they developed a document that was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, which was an official document stating what Congress is going to consist of and what it's going to do. It basically just said, we're still going to have a Congress, and here's how it's going to operate, but it's going to be rules, and it's going to be official, and we're going to abide by it. We're not just going to be doing sort of whatever we want. We're not Parliament, but just so that we can just meet and say, well, we'll do whatever we want. We're supreme. No, we're going to be following the principles of the Articles of Confederation, which is going to be like our governing document. And to make it official, it's got to be ratified. It's like any other legal document. It has to be ratified. It's like any kind of a contract. If you have a contract, if you hire a lawyer to write a contract for you, a business contract of some kind, the lawyer will draw up the contract, and he'll draft it, and maybe he'll sign it, and the other party's lawyer will sign it, but it's not official until you sign it. You, as the party to the contract, have to decide if you approve it, and then you sign it, and then it becomes official. It doesn't become official until you sign it, until you ratify it as the actual party to the contract. So, who are the parties to the contract? The Declaration of the Articles of Confederation is a contract. Who are the parties? Well, the parties are the 13 states. They are going to make a contract among themselves as states. So it's their state that has to ratify the contract, and by state, who does that mean in actuality? It means the state legislature. So the state legislatures have to ratify this contract, the Articles of Confederation. All of them have to do it. It's only good if everybody involved ratifies. And so the 13 state legislatures have to ratify the articles. Well, this is a legal formality. It has to be done, but it's a legal formality. And 12 states ratified it quickly without any trouble. But one state did not. Why not? What state was it? Well, come back next week and find out.